Services like the healthcare of our citizens, the education of our children. At the moment, by virtue of the $80 billion cut to health and education that the states and territories have experienced, we don't have those resources. And I welcome Premier Baird's contribution today. What he's done is outlined that even beyond the $80 billion cut, we have an even bigger problem. That is a growing healthcare budget in circumstances where we have one of the most efficient healthcare systems in the world, and there just isn't enough resources at both a Commonwealth or a state level to meet those needs. Now, that's why I want this on the agenda, firmly on the agenda at the Leaders' Retreat. I'm not prepared to rule anything in or out, because I believe we need to have this debate.
Under what circumstances would you support an increase to 15%?
Well, I haven't indicated any support for an increase in the GST. What I've indicated is that there should be a discussion about new revenue measures. My proposition is that we should actually increase the GST in terms of its breadth by covering financial services. It's not an area that's presently taxed. It's an omission from the scope, if you like, and it doesn't hit poorest families the hardest. It's one of the few changes you can make to GST which can increase the revenue but not actually hurt poorer families the hardest. So that's the sort of change I want to see. That is, any change that can raise revenue but it doesn't come out of the pockets of those who can least afford it.
So you don't actually want an increase in the rate itself?
Well, I'm prepared to have a discussion about all these matters, and that's what's being proposed by Premier Baird. He's put firmly on the agenda this fundamental proposition, that is that healthcare needs in this nation can't be met with the money that we're raising at the moment. And I'm not prepared to sit by and watch ordinary, everyday South Australians have their healthcare needs unmet because state and territories just simply don't have the resources by virtue of these federal government cuts. And I can keep whinging about that, or I can go along to a national discussion and seek to be part of a national debate where we try and have a constructive discussion about how we solve that problem.
So you talked about the federal cuts before the last election. Before the election, you promised not to support an increase of the GST. What's changed?
Well, I said nothing of the sort. What I've said consistently is that GST is a tax which hurts those on lowest income the hardest, and it's really the last place that we should be looking for revenue measures. That's why I propose other measures. I've looked at superannuation. The Commonwealth have ruled that out. I've looked at the question of increasing the GST on things like financial services. There's also a proposition floated by the Premier of Victoria about increasing the Medicare levy. These are all matters that should be on the table as we grapple with this important issue.
Would that also include a reduction in the rate of South Australia's take of GST?
No, I mean the way in which GST works, any increase in the GST by expanding its breadth or increasing its rate would be distributed on a per capita basis.
But Premier, aren't you having a bob each way that you're saying I don't necessarily support it? Isn't that a backdoor method of saying, well, I do support it, but I just want someone else to be responsible for it?
No, I'm prepared to accept responsibility for my position. My position is that we need a mature debate about all of these issues, and you don't get a mature debate by simply going into an important discussion by ruling things out. Obviously, I have my preferences. I want a set of revenue measures where people on higher incomes pay proportionately more. I've published some data from NatSem which shows that if you impose GST on fresh food, it's very regressive. It hits poorest people the hardest. On health, it hits poorest people the hardest. Education, it's about essentially neutral. But financial services, it's progressive. In other words, people on higher incomes pay more. That's why I've suggested we should look to that area first. But the gap is massive. The gap is massive compared with what we need to spend to make sure that people have a hospital bed when they need one, and what we're presently raising as revenue. And somebody needs to tell the truth about that. Premier Baird has raised that question, and that's why I support him in having this discussion.
Hasn't Dan Andrew torpedoed the discussion for an equal stance?
No, Dan Andrews shares the same view that I have, that GST is a regressive tax, and I think that he's disappointed that the Commonwealth Government, which has many of the other progressive taxation measures, such as income tax, should look to that first. I mean, it is, I think, wrong for the Commonwealth Government to cut $80 billion out of health and education. It's wrong for the Commonwealth Government to say that health and education is an add-on it should be the first thing funded off the federal budget, not the last thing funded, and then ask for the states to actually try and remedy this dispute. But we have a stalemate, and it has to be resolved, and leaders have to lead. That's why we're going to this summit, this retreat, with ideas. We've put up 4 ideas for the reform of the Federation. We're not just there proposing revenue measures. We're talking about a national network charging scheme so we can get more investment into the arteries of our economy, our roads. We've talked about changes to the way in which we organise the care of chronic diseases by having collaborative arrangements between the Commonwealth and the states. We've talked about a big change in the way in which education is organised so that the states have full responsibility from birth all the way to the end of high school. And we've also talked about changes to the way in which our housing system works so we get more investment in housing supply so that people can actually realise their dream of having a home for themselves and their families. We've put big issues on the agenda. We want a constructive debate, and that's why we've welcomed the ideas that have come forward.
On the GST, how would you propose to put in protections for those low-income earners that we talked about? How would that work?
Well, Premier Baird has put a proposition that is people on low incomes or even moderate incomes from $100,000 and below would be fully compensated either through the tax system or through the benefit system, the income transfer system. So I haven't yet seen the full details of his proposition, but he's raised the matter with me. I said I am very concerned about the regressive nature of GST. And before we could have any sensible discussion about that, we need to grapple with those questions.
When did he raise it with you? Did he talk to you before?
I've had discussions with Premier Baird over an extended period about these matters.
TAFE SA has today confirmed that it plans to cut 500 jobs over the forward estimates. Should Treasury be forcing TAFE to make those job cuts when the state's unemployment rate is 8.2%?
Well, as with the private providers, TAFE has to work within the system of funding we provide for our training and further education system. We basically have had a very high level of funding. It was a time-limited program where we trained over 100,000 people. That's come to an end. Both the private providers and the public provider now have to live in an environment where there is fewer resources available for further education and training. That's as we promised, and it's just returning to more normal levels of funding. We would like to be able to sustain those levels at the higher levels of funding, but we simply cannot afford to do so.
But what about the cuts? Are you happy with 500 job cuts?
Well, they're not. They're matters for TAFE about how it lives within its means. We want them, though, to deliver high-quality training. We want them to deliver that training in a way which is accessible to as many South Australians as possible, including in the country regions. And we also want to do it in a way which matches up people with a job. The whole point of these reforms is to make people work ready so that they have the skills that will give them the best chance of getting a job.
Can TAFE carry that out when they're cutting so many jobs and looking at closing campuses?
Well, we were accused of protecting TAFE a few weeks ago. Now we're apparently accused of cutting TAFE. The truth is that we need a first-class system of public provision of further education. That's what TAFE provides. They're funded to do that. Sure, they have to make economies to live within their means, and that's what they're doing.
Are you facing a major fight with the Police Association? It's unhappy with the restructure that's currently underway and says it won't settle its EBA until it gets some answers on how deep these cuts to police will be.
Look, they're matters for the new Commissioner to manage. I'm sure he'll engage in detailed discussions with the police and their representatives and settle this matter.
Okay, and that is the South Australian Premier Jay Weatherill speaking on a number of issues, but primarily